In 52 weeks, or about a year, on May 9th, 2022, the Philippines is going to have its next presidential election. And I just want to spend this time thinking about what that actually means for not just me and you, but for the world. And so over the next, year, I guess I will be thinking about this aloud. I feel like a lot of my time is spent thinking about these certain things just in my head, and I feel like perhaps if I, say them out loud, then they will be able to leave my head and maybe go into yours, or at least, have you think about these issues as well, because I think it's quite important to really be conscious about the direction we are heading towards over the next several months. So for this, for today, I guess what I want to think about is what it means for the Philippines to be a democracy. Obviously it's impossible for me to get into all of it today. But I just want to give some random thoughts going to my head right now and see where it leads us for this video. So the Philippines is technically, a democracy. What does a democracy even mean? I think for many people, different definitions are, brought about to talk about what democracy is. For this video, I think I want to define democracy as democracy is a system of government in which the citizens have the power, or they have the decision, or they have the choice, the ability to choose who will represent them in the affairs of the state. So let me repeat that. In a democracy, the citizens have the ability to choose who will represent them in the affairs of the state. So I'm going to try to break that down a little bit more. Every single day, because of the way in which our society is structured, there are many small decisions made. Every few minutes, there are these small decisions made that can influence not just one particular city or one particular province, but the entire country. And theoretically, if we were to democratically vote on each single issue or each decision, it is just impractical. Because of how many there are and how widespread, all of these different small things are. For example, questions about public utilities or about road constructions, or perhaps how to allocate taxes, or perhaps public things. Those decisions are not the easiest to make, and again, it would be too impractical if all of us would have to vote for every single one whenever they have to make those decisions. So in order for us to kind of solve that problem, in which it's too difficult for everyone to be able to decide on every single thing, we have found a system in which, how about we elect representative people who will act on the behalf of the desires of the average person, and give them that job, make it their full-time job to behave and to make decisions in a way that will best represent the majority of the people in that province or city or the country. And that those people are what constitute the government. So theoretically, every single decision we would be able to vote on, but because that's too impractical, instead we choose representatives, we elect representatives who will behave in a way that will ideally be close to what the majority of the people desire. So how does that work in practice when we're voting? When we see many different candidates who will come up, some of them are self-nominated, some of them, were encouraged by certain people in the population to run for office. And when we have, say, for example, candidates A, B, and C, theoretically, the individual citizen, say, for example, me, I will look at each candidate and see what their different policy positions are. I will see how they would probably behave if given a certain situation, because theoretically, whoever I'm going to vote for is the person who will represent my concerns and my desires. In a sense in which, if I were to have voted on every single issue, the person who I would want to represent me would be the one who will be closest to how I would vote. So theoretically, say there's candidates A, B, and C. I'll look at each one and maybe I'll hear them speak. I'll hear their positions on certain policies. If they have political history, I can look back on their past experience and I can say, okay, I think if this problem would emerge, this person would respond in this way, and will respond in a way that is closer to what I would think I would respond to how I would respond, and therefore I would prefer him to represent me. And theoretically, in the whole population, everyone would think in that way, and eventually, whoever becomes elected into that position, whether it's mayor or governor or or president, that person would then be acting on behalf of the people who voted for them. They would share the concerns, and they would share the different problem-solving methods that the people who voted for them prefer, because that's what they are. They're representatives of the people. They're not necessarily meant to act on their own behalf. Actually, they're not supposed to act on their own behalf. They're supposed to act as representatives of the people who don't have the free time to kind of make those minor decisions that are made every single day. So that's theoretically how it works, right? So whoever becomes elected would have received the most amount of votes, meaning that the most number of people in the population would have believed that that candidate would best represent their concerns. And so they get a chance to behave and rule in for how many years, whether it's 4 in the US or 6 in the Philippines. After that cycle ends, there's a reevaluation of what happened over that past time period, and the people get the chance to vote again and say, well, do I want to vote for someone who represents the same kind of ideology as the person who just had office, or do I want to vote for someone who represents something else? And those other things will be brought up in the course of the election cycle as the candidates emerge. Okay, so theoretically, that's how it all works. But in practice, it's a bit more complicated. It doesn't really work that way. So in my example earlier, where I said there are 3 candidates, and I'd look at each one of them, and I'd see what their policy positions are, and I'd see which ones align most to my ideals, that process actually can never be perfect. And that process is, for many people, quite impossible to get to. The reality is, when we have many candidates and all of this stuff, the average person has a family, has a job, has a career, has their own, mental, worlds that they have to spend their time thinking about. Not everyone has the amount of energy and the amount of time to really research about every single candidate in order to make sure that they know every single thing they're going to do, especially if that candidate does not have any prior political experience. Because if you had the difference between someone with political experience and someone who doesn't is that someone with political experience, we can look back on their past and see, how that would probably reflect how they will act in the future. For people with no political experience, it's a bit of a question mark. Okay, so since the average person does not have the energy or time to really research every single candidate to know which one matches their concerns, how do they know who to vote for? Now, this is where we're going to start moving into a tangent where I'm just going to be theorizing. I'm going to give suggestions. I'll suggest a framework of things that will probably explain some of this at least. The average person does not have the time to research every single candidate. Therefore, a lot of it requires trust. And the trust does not necessarily just mean trust towards a certain candidate, but trust towards anyone. So whether that means my teacher in school says they trust this candidate, I trust that they know more than I do, therefore I'll trust my teacher. Or my parent, my parent has lived so long and they have trust, they know what they're saying, so I'm going to trust those people. So one of them is trust and authority. And because one in a very deep sense knows that they do not really know that much about every single policy issue, every single thing, there's an ease to just trust authority. I don't want to spend so much time on it. I trust that guy, he's smart, I'll believe him. Or that person seemed to say what, I think I believe, so I'll trust them. Now, the problem is that today in the social media age, well, it's true for all of history, but especially today, the question of who has authority is a bit, wonky. Who is the person who has authority? Who is the person who I can trust? In today's age, most of that ends up becoming people who have large presences online or in the media, whether that means celebrities or actors or models or businessmen even, social media stars. These are the people who their livelihood is the accumulation of kind of trust from a certain audience. When people are a fan of someone, they kind of see themselves in them, and therefore there's also a sense of trust implicit in that, where I think that that person is a good person. Therefore, when that person decides to do something, it must also be, in the same good that I see myself in with them. And maybe that was confusing, but you can rewind that, and there's some sense in that. Okay, so the people who have the most influence to change, or to the people who have the most influence in our society today are people with large megaphones or microphones. These are people with large followings. These are people who have large kind of structural capacities to advertise, say, for example, big companies or big businesses. And so what ends up happening is that the most efficient way for a candidate who wants to become president or who wants to become a politician, the most efficient way to gather support, given that most of the people in the population do not have the time to actually research every single person, the most efficient way to gather support is to gather support from those with large followings, or to gather support from those with large megaphones. And what ends up happening is that the people who aspire for power end up, instead of spending their time trying to say what they need to say in order to get the public support, they say what they need to say, or they promise what they need to promise to get the support of the people with large megaphones, because they know that that is the most efficient way to not only get their voice out and to get their name out, but to get support generally. The average person, if I trust a certain public figure and they endorse a candidate, given that I don't have the time to look at other things in my life and spend so much time on that, I'll just think, well, if they endorse the candidate and they give their kind of, one-liner reason for endorsing their candidate, I'll say, well, I see myself in that person. I'll trust that what they're saying is true, as opposed to another public figure that I dislike. So what ends up happening is that the people who aspire for power only need or the most efficient way to gather support is to appease the needs or the desires of the class of people who have the largest megaphones. And unfortunately, that group of people who has the most kind of say or sway in society also end up constituting a very small class of people. You can call it an economic class or a social class or socio-economic class, but it's a sliver of people. And one only needs to really get the support of a sliver of people, and then those people will do the proselytizing, they'll do the advertising for you. They'll spend their time, if the person who has a big megaphone feels that this candidate, or was convinced by this candidate, that their needs will be met, then now they will be in support of that person, and they'll be publicly in support of that person, and therefore they will be able to spend the next several months talking about why they think that person would win, without the person even having to say anything, without the candidate even ever having to say anything. All they need is a group of people with large megaphones to support them through whatever method that they have in terms of gathering that support, whether it's through literal payment or bribe. I guess it's not really called a bribe, but just payment, or having them, talking to them, or just giving them attention, having them feel affiliated with their run to the presidency. All of that stuff is very appealing for many people. So people with large megaphones end up, over the next few months, over the next year, you'll be seeing certain celebrities, certain people, certain popular figures endorse their support for certain candidates. And it will be very easy for us to just think that, because I think this person knows what they're saying, or because I think that this person is similar to me, then I will trust that they know what they're saying. But again, this is just, it's confusing, because what ends up happening is that when they get into the positions of power, they start having to, the politicians end up having to appease the many people who help bring them to that position, whether it's businessmen or advertisers or celebrities. And the focus of their policies will be directed towards that very thin class. And the majority of people who feel like they thought that they voted for someone who represented their concerns will end up feeling duped, because now suddenly, they're doing things that are disconnected from what the public desires, which is what theoretically the democracy is supposed to be about anyway. But anyway, this is just some random problems that we have in democracies. Obviously, there's so many more, and I can go into it for hours and hours, but I'll end it here for this video, and I hope that you have a nice weekend.